Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we'll be celebrating 50 years since the big event known as Woodstock had occurred. As many of you may be familiar with, this was a huge event as a musical festival over the course of 3 to 4 days, which occurred in a wonderful field up in upstate New York. It was really well known because this was a place where the music artist had actually said the true stars of the show were actually the people who showed up to attend. It was also an opportunity where someone who'd actually had their very first time away from home as a teenager who was able to attend this historic event with her cousin. This was an event that was attended by close to 500,000 people. She also experienced an enormous outpouring of what we would call unconditional love, demonstrations of selflessness and compassion by many there that left a big impression which lasted into their adult years. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Reverend Violet Young, as she shares her lifetime of valuable lessons from attending Woodstock. Violet, thank you for being back on the program today.
Oh, Daniel, thank you so much for having me, and that almost made me cry, that introduction.
Well, you know, crying is sometimes what we do here.
I do it a lot, frankly.
Now, how old were you when you went to this event? Where were you living? What was going on in your life at the time?
I was still living at home. I was 19 years old. I had been graduated from high school the year before, and I had gotten a job at a bank, and I had done my year at the bank, and then I was working as a temp. And it was a very unusual situation for me to have met up with my cousin the day I did, and then for her to say, oh, let's get tickets and go. So my mother was still had me by the apron strings at the age of 19.
Now, what did you know about Woodstock before you went?
Well, the reason I even went was my cousin and I had ended up at the beach together with a family outing, which in all the years my family had been going to the beach in Massachusetts, we go to the beach. It was an unusual thing. They had never come to the beach with us. And this particular day, they did, and because she and I were the oldest of the three girls, we ended up moving our blankies away to the side so that we'd have our privacy, as young women do. And she brought a radio, and we had been listening. That's the first thing I heard of it was that day with the radio commercials. And they started talking about this festival in upstate New York, and they were listing off the people who were going to be performing. The people I recognized were Joan Baez and Arlo Guthrie and Richie Havens. Those were the only three people I really recognized. But that's how come we ended up to go. My cousin and I were listening to the radio ads, and all of a sudden she said, I think we should get tickets and go. And I was kind of shocked because that wasn't something I would have done on my own. And I said, okay, the way 19-year-olds do. So he said, okay, and then we made plans.
Now, were you living in New York at the time?
No, I was living in Boston.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
okay.
She lived in Framingham, and I lived in Malden, which are both bedroom communities of Boston. And, neither one of us drove, she lived at home, too. And neither one of us were wealthy. I was working as a temp and paying my mom rent. And it was sort of like, what should we do here? How are they ever going to let us go? Because we were still thinking, I was working and paying rent, but I was still kind of under the thumb, and she definitely was because she was a little younger than me. And she says, I'll tell you what, we'll buy the tickets first, then we'll tell them, and then they won't want us to waste the money, and they'll let us go. And I went, okay. So I sent her a money order, and she bought the tickets. And we told our folks, and they said, well, we don't want you to waste, by verbatim, we don't want you to waste the money. You should go. So we said, great. But, I was a young girl, and that that I had never been away from home without my family. I mean, when I was a kid in the 50s, we didn't do sleepovers at my family, and nobody in my family had ever gone camping. So to say that I packed poorly for the trip would be a gross understatement. I look back on that and think, wow, it's amazing that we didn't have more issues. Anyway.
So now, how many days did you attend the event?
Well, we left early on Friday morning, and we took a train to New York City, and then we changed from Grand Central. We walked over to the Port Authority bus station, got on a bus, and so Friday evening found us heading in, being dropped off in a cornfield in New York because the bus driver couldn't go anymore because there was no place for him to go. Lord knows, now that I think about driving, I don't even know how the poor guy turned around because it was a Greyhound bus. But we arrived Friday night, and we left at some point on Sunday in the early evening. We left, I could hear Jimi Hendrix. I left before I saw Jimi Hendrix. I could hear him, but some people there had a car, and we got out because by Sunday night we were a wreck. But Friday we just got dumped off in the middle of a cornfield and started walking towards the stage area, and there were hundreds of people walking in that direction, so we knew we were going the right way. It was amazing.
Now, I had the opportunity to interview Michael Lang, who was the person who put together Woodstock.
Oh, how cool.
And, this was some years back, and then the movie Chasing Woodstock had actually come out not too long after that. And so as I talked to him, he says, I couldn't really imagine that this would come together the way that it did. But, the fact was this was an event that was over the course of the 3 to 4 days, and you really bought tickets to go to see one day, but the problem was nobody was leaving.
Yeah.
And it turned out that you guys did, so.
Well, we left at the end.
Right.
It was amazing. When we got off the bus, I mean, we're two young girls from Boston. We've never really been anywhere. We get off, the bus driver says, everybody off the bus, and we're looking around going, but we're not at the site. And, yeah, but I can't go any further. So we get off the bus, and we start moving, walking, and I don't know how long we walked, maybe a mile or two from where we parked. And eventually we crossed over some downed fences. And we just kept going because there were all these people, and we're all moving en masse to this area. And eventually we got to the top. We got to this little road area. It was like they had tamped down some grass, and there was this little road, and that's where people were moving up and down. And we were at the edge of the bowl leading down toward the concert stage. We could see the stage. And I could not believe how many people. I mean, I lived in Boston. I mean, there's a lot of people in Boston, but there weren't people like this all at one time. And it was just, the energy was amazing. But I was 19. I had no language for that. I didn't understand. I couldn't have said those words. I couldn't have said the energy was amazing. All I could say at the age of 19 was, wow. And there were thousands and thousands of people. It was like my little brain was like on overload. And then I could hear Richie Havens, I could hear Arlo Guthrie, I could hear Joan Baez, and it was like, oh, these folks are familiar. And just recognizing that there were that many folks. I mean, my cousin and I kept looking at each other going, this isn't what we were expecting. I mean, I had been to a concert before. My very first concert was to go into Boston. It was a big deal to go to the Back Bay Theater and see Peter, Paul, and Mary. And there were a lot of people at that concert. The place was full. That place was nothing compared to Woodstock. it was just an outrageous experience. And, people were painted up and they were dressed like hippies because that's how people were dressing. We looked pretty straight. We had jeans and T-shirts and stuff. We looked straight compared to everybody else. And one of the things, when I mentioned I packed poorly, my cousin's father gave us these two orange heavy-duty plastic roll-up pup tents. They rolled into a tube, a shape, and when you unfurled them, there was like a ridge line on one side of the bag that you inflated, and then you inflated two sides of the mouth of the bag, and that made your pup tent. And that was what we had for shelter. We had, I think, a blanket or two, thin blanket. And we didn't bring much. I mean, on our way to the fair, between the Grand Central Station and the bus station, we stopped at my very first Walgreens, and we bought a tuna sandwich and a bag of cookies. And we still had some of the cookies at Woodstock in our little bag. But as far as packing for camping, we didn't know what we were doing. And we had been told there would be food at the event. So there wasn't much of that either. But when we arrived, we set up our little tent eventually that evening, and people kept saying, "Oh, what a cute little tent." And evidently somebody at the event was selling those tents as well, because the next morning, when I had gone to sleep next to Sharon in her little tent, and then the next morning when I woke up, I got out of the little pup tent. Talk about uncomfortable, but at 19 you don't care. I got up, I looked around, and my cousin was nowhere to be found, Daniel. That was scary. And there was a little note that she had used like a paperclip on my tent, and it said, "I have moved closer to the site. You'll know me by the orange tent." And she had left, but in the morning I discovered there were like hundreds of orange tents because somebody was selling them. So not only didn't I know where my cousin was, but now there were a whole lot of orange tents, and I was scared to death. So after a bit of panic, we found each other. Well, I found her, and she had indeed moved closer to the site, not by close, but she could see the stage better. And so we were at a slight angle, and that's where we spent the next couple of days, on the blanket.
Now, let's talk about the people, surrounding you. What were the connections like? How was all that?
There were people in all ages. There were lots of young people like us, but there was a lot of people who were older than us. There were kids. It was a big, big mix of, there were black people and white people and just different colored people. I mean, being in Boston, there was a cross-section of folks. At Woodstock, there was a much bigger cross-section of folks. And everybody was lovely. We were all having a good time because the music was pretty much going all the time. And, we had our little blankie. We set ourselves up there, and people were very friendly, and they were kind. If you needed something, would you hold this? Would you put this down? People were doing that. And, of course, mind you, we were close. I mean, everybody's seen pictures of Woodstock. When it's no exaggeration to say that if you turned around, your elbow would be in somebody's nose. So everybody had to be pretty mindful so that they weren't knocking each other out just from turning around. And the people were really into the music, and they were really into the event, and it became really clear the next day that there were a lot of us. When we arrived at night, you really couldn't see everything. But in the morning light, when you stood up, there is no description to being in that environment from somebody who the closest I got to a bunch of people I didn't know was hanging on the subways. You know, you were holding onto a strap on a subway where you're up against people. The feeling at Woodstock was so different from that. I mean, I've been next to a lot of folks on a subway where you're stuck at an odd angle for quite some time while the next train ahead of you leaves, and you're practically sitting in someone's lap that you don't know. It didn't feel good. At Woodstock, it didn't matter. Everybody was happy. There was nobody feeling like, you shouldn't be that close to me, which is not the same. You know, when you're on a subway train, nobody wants you to be that close to you. And the people were just warm, and you know, if somebody had something, you know, I've been asked, well, what about food? Well, there wasn't very much food. I mean, we were parceling out our cookies. I mean, we had a little bag of those little tiny cookies, and we were down to crumbs, and we're 19 years old, so we aren't necessarily focused on eating every minute, but, you know, all of a sudden there would be a hot dog coming through the crowd on a stick, and everybody would take a bite until the hot dog was gone. I remember several cans of beans going through the crowd with a spoon in them. You know, somebody heated up a can of beans and went down through the crowd. Everybody take a bite, pass it along. Nobody thought about it. We just took a bite and passed it along. And, you know, that we could accumulate a little trash. Somebody would pass out these humongous, like 4-foot-tall paper trash bags. And somebody would, all of a sudden, there'd be this big trash bag coming by. Everybody would put whatever trash they had, pass it along. At somebody at the top of the hill, they'd pick it up and take it someplace else. Now, you got to understand, the management didn't know what to do with this because, geez, they weren't expecting 500,000 people. But they were doing the best they could. And eventually we heard the famous, the New York Thruway is closed, man. It was like, oh, my God. And my girlfriend, who hadn't really been around this area and had not heard about it so much, she said, why was the Thruway closed? Because there was nowhere else for anybody to go. Everybody wanted to get there. And they just ran out of room on the Thruway was a parking lot. I saw pictures of it later. It was like, oh, my God. So that's when my cousin and I decided to get up and walk up to where the phones were. That was an experience. Now, mind you, we're sitting on a postage stamp of a blanket, and she had a camera and a pair of binoculars. I didn't have that stuff. She was trying to take pictures. But we didn't want to haul all of that stuff because, remember, number one, it's August, and it's August in upstate New York, and it was hot. It was very hot. When the sun was out, it was relentlessly hot. And then, of course, it would rain periodically. But that particular part of the day, we decided to go check out the phones. So we didn't want to repack all of our stuff and lose our spot. So we just asked the people around us to keep an eye on our stuff. And after the 5-hour trip to get out of where we were, pick our way through by walking on other people's blankets to get to the little road area to stand in line for the phones, we came back to our blanket, and everything was exactly where we had left it. And people we're happy to have you back. Oh, good, you made it back. Yay. You know, because finding your way back was really tricky. But we stood in line for quite some time. I mean, it took us almost an hour, more than an hour, just to get up to where the phones were. And then we passed the porta potties, and they were already getting kind of grody. And we just went and stood in a line. We found the line for the phone, and we stood in line. We talked to people. We watched people. We listened to the music, and the line moved very slowly. And eventually, after the line had moved really slowly for like 2 hours or more, we decided to just give up and figure that our folks would figure out that we were okay. And then we picked our way back to the blanket, which was more problematic than leaving because we were trying to keep an idea of where exactly we were. So that took quite a bit of time to come back. And by the time we were done, we were exhausted just from that little walk because it was like really, really hot. And I'm very fair-skinned. And by Sunday, I looked like I had been toasted. I had sunburn blisters all over me. So, yeah. Everybody was kind. Everybody took care of each other. They were making sure that, whatever anybody had, they were sharing. There was a little bit of water, they'd share that. We didn't feel deprived by any means. So.
I know when they had Woodstock 2, if you will, back in the 90s, I actually asked him about that because that turned into quite a situation that was much different. Actually, it was about 180 degrees different. And, he says it really all depends on what your motivation is to plan a festival. That was something that a lot of corporations got involved with.
Uh-huh.
And they just tried to extract, as much money as they could, just basically nickel and dime everybody to death. And certainly there was quite a protest against that. And, so you can see how, something like someone in need and help, in a situation like that, everybody was out for themselves as they were actually put into a situation that would cause that sort of thinking versus, at a place like Woodstock, the first round where there were a lot of people actually quite a bit in need. One thing that seems to be overlooked about the Woodstock experience was the incredible donations of a local dairy, with the thousands of gallons of milk and, hundreds and hundreds of pounds of cheese that were donated because a lot of people made sure the drugs and the alcohol showed up, but they didn't have any clue as to, what are we going to do about something to eat, as you were talking about. Being able to nibble on a cracker, passing a hot dog between 10 or 15 people, or a can of beans.
Yeah, that was kind of dramatic.
Certainly, but it was, great that people actually at that time opened up to say, I'm probably hungrier than this, but as you say, knowing your neighbors or when you perceive someone as different, what you can do to connect. Certainly a hot dog can connect you with somebody that you really, don't seem to really know or you feel is different as well. And
so, what I remember, and like I wrote in my little article that you got, was the level of care that everybody was making. Every once in a while, I know that there were babies born there because there was a couple of announcements about that. Wavy Gravy with his, what we have in mind is breakfast in bed, 500,000. I wasn't one of the 500,000 who got the breakfast in bed from that, because they only had so much to go. But they tried. They made this effort, and it made everybody else want to make an effort. And for all I know, it would have been an organic thing anyway, but I had nothing to which to compare. If you were on a subway in Boston and you needed something, you didn't get that kind of attention the way the people at Woodstock gave it. And understanding, when I look back on that to an extent, understanding the levels that they had to stretch to make this work at all. And, when the movie came out, a year or so later, or whenever the movie came out, I don't remember exactly, but I remember standing in line to get into the movie to see it the first time, and they had programs. I still have my original Woodstock program, and they were passing out programs for the movie, and I still have that one. It was a sort of a replica type of thing. And it was hysterical because at the movie theater, when you're in a movie theater, Daniel, they make you sit in seats, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Well, not at that showing. The showing I went to, there were people on the floor. People were throwing balloons around. They were batting balloons around the whole auditorium. They were passing joints in the auditorium, and all the ushers picking their way over the people that were sitting on the floor was, please put out your smoke. Please put out your smoke. It fell on deaf ears. So the auditorium, when I say an auditorium for Woodstock movie was full, it was beyond capacity. And it sort of had the same kind of feeling. Everybody was really happy and friendly and all that. But when I saw the movie, I was shocked because, wow, when you're there, you see it, but from looking at it from the distance of a movie camera, that was just one heck of a big event, you know. To have so many people in so many life situations all jammed together like sardines. And I know that there were reports of here and there were some issues, but overall, it was a very peaceful event. And I never, when I saw the movie, there were people in the lake and there was people here. I never saw any of that because we hardly left the blanket. I mean, after the trip to the telephones and the scariness of the porta potties, nobody peed again for the entire weekend.
Wow.
Seriously.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're not eating or drinking, there's not much going on anyway, and all we did was sweat because it was hot. And then, of course, it rained. And never forget that this event took place in a cow pasture. Now, a cow pasture when it's dry is one thing. And a cow pasture when it's wet with heavy-duty thunderstorm rain, very different, very, very different.
Not to mention 500,000 feet trampling along.
Yeah, or, it was, I joke that we did, in fact, move a lot closer to the stage, and I'm not kidding about this, because eventually, after it rained and rained and rained, everybody where we were sitting slid ever so slowly en masse, eventually stopping a few more feet down the hill. It wasn't like we were at an acute angle, but we were enough of an angle with lots of water pushing us a little bit. But nobody cared. We all dried out because the sun would come out, and it was incredibly hot. I didn't get to write in my article about the helicopter that came in after a storm one of the times it rained and dropped daisies on the crowd. I had my little daisy until the petals fell off. There were hundreds and hundreds of daisies that were just flying through the air and people were catching them. It was so cool. And then at one point, there was a skywriter that came over and did an enormous peace sign in the sky, and the crowd just went nuts. It was incredible. And the energy, the care, the excitement, and the music was wonderful. I mean, I had never heard most of these groups at all. And I mean, imagine getting to hear Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young right off the bat. And, they didn't do their best performance, but they did a great performance because it was raw. It was happening in that moment. And to see Roger Daltrey swinging his mic, oh, my goodness, oh, my. It was great we had the binoculars. And, I'd never heard Janis Joplin. I mean, I was a very, very naive individual. I mean, I was 19. I grew up watching the Vietnam War on TV, right? Everybody saw the war. But nobody talked about it at my house, so I didn't know all of what was really going on. And so, Country Joe and the Fish, they got up to sing, and they started screaming, "Give me an F! Give me a U! Give me a C! Give me a K! Mm-hmm. What's that spell?" I didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Daniel, I didn't know. I didn't know. Nobody I knew used that term. Not so much now, but back then I had never used it. And I had no idea what it meant. And all of a sudden, I got it. I got that the war, from their perspective, was wow. And I had an epiphanal moment. I started to put it was like all of a sudden my wiring got rewired or got connected, and I started to understand the importance of caring on a big way. I mean, I had volunteered, and my mother was a very caring woman and give you the shirt off her back, and I had an aunt like that, but it was selective. This was just a flat place of everybody was kind. Everybody cared, and that was the way it was supposed to be. And what an impression that made on me.
I can imagine. I know that, as you say in your article, that you ended up making a pen that says, across the top, my first trip away from home was to Woodstock, and at the bottom it says, still there.
Well, you know, and that was only a few years ago. In Yachats, we have a big thing on the 4th of July, and this particular year they had put on a little street fair with vendors, and this particular guy had a button machine. Would you like to make a button? And I said, sure. And I thought, what should I make a button about? And he said, well, what was special in your life? And it just clicked, and I went, you know, that's what my button says. So I wear it to my show every year. But, you know, it turned me from somebody who was afraid. I was afraid. I had been brought up by people who had been in World War II. They had suffered through the Great Depression. They had dealt with emigration. They had, you know, they had struggles, big struggles, and they wanted better for us, but they sort of geared me to be afraid. You know, I'd be in the subway, and I'd be hanging on to my purse for dear life. I would be, which is not a stupid thing, mind you, but, you know, being confident and taking care of your stuff is different than being fearful that someone's going to take it from you. Mm-hmm. There's a big difference in energy about that. And I had been brought up to be more fearful. Fearful that we wouldn't have enough, fearful that I wouldn't get what I needed, fearful of a whole lot of things. Right. And when I was at Woodstock, there was no need for that. There was no fear. That was one of the things I really noticed, that there was no fear. It was just a relief. Everybody gave a ding-dong about each other. And so then people started talking about stuff. I mean, I was listening to people talk about the war. I was listening to people talk about connections with people. We had wonderful conversations. And I was having conversations like I'd never had before, ever, with anybody. You know, working in a bank, you're not discussing the world views like that. It's just not happening.
It was definitely a different time. As you know, I mean, this day and age, we can kind of look back on it and say, you know, why not today? But, you know, everybody can have their opportunity to, you know, make that happen. And, you know, certainly I want to thank you for being on the program today to recount this marvelous event 50 years later and how you gained some tremendous insight and experience that has carried with you certainly forward. What would you like to leave our listeners with?
Well, I think that the most important thing, is that we need to be conscious about kindness. Now, I know there's a lot of these random acts of kindness. They need to be radical acts of kindness every day. Notice when people need help and step in and do something. Get to know your neighbors. And when you notice somebody's different from you, try finding a connection instead of demonizing them. Also, that people are often in pain. I mean, everybody's got emotional pain or some physical pain. And, you know, it affects how we work in our lives. It affects how we connect with other people. Instead of withdrawing, extend yourself. Make a connection. See what you can do to interact and assist people. Because the more you do that, the happier you'll be, and the happier they'll be. And any time somebody needs to ask for help, always remember that if you ask for help, you're giving an opportunity to someone else to shine. And that's a way, it's a symbiotic relationship. It's not a bad thing to ask for help. It's a good thing. And all I can say is happy 50th anniversary to Woodstock, and thank you for giving me my life lessons.
Absolutely. Violet, thank you so much for being on the Beyond 50 radio program. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Daniel, and we'll talk again, I hope.
You bet.
All right.
Peace.
Peace.
We
Bye-bye.
want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can discover more at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter to keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50, as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.